Once we're married, he'll sign whatever I put in front of him. The man is so lovesick it's embarrassing. And his daddy? That old fool won't know what hit him until the land's already gone. That's what I heard my son's fiancée say on the phone, standing in the hallway of my own home on Thanksgiving night, while my son was in the kitchen carving the turkey. She laughed after she said it. A low, satisfied laugh, like someone who's already won. I was standing at the top of the stairs, having come down from my bedroom to grab my reading glasses. I stopped cold on the third step from the bottom. The pocket door to the sitting room was half open, and through the gap I could see her silhouette near the window, her back turned, her voice kept low the way people keep their voice low when they're saying something they know they shouldn't. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The timber rights alone are worth close to $2 million, she continued, and he's already put Daniel's name on the deed. All I need is to get the ring on my finger, give it about a year, and then we restructure. It'll look completely voluntary. Trust me, I've done this before. A pause while the other person spoke. Daniel won't be a problem. He thinks I hung the moon. He actually cried the first time I told him I loved him. Can you imagine? More laughter. I gripped the banister. My knuckles went white. In 37 years of building a life in Polk County, Texas, I had never once wanted to put my hands around another person's throat. In that moment, I understood exactly how that impulse feels. I straightened up slowly, took one long breath, and walked the rest of the way down the stairs, making just enough noise to announce myself. By the time I pushed open the pocket door, she was already slipping her phone into the pocket of her cardigan, turning to face me with that wide, easy smile she always wore around me. "Harold," she said brightly. I was just stepping away for a second. "It's so loud in the kitchen." I looked at her for a moment. She was 28 years old, pretty in a careful, deliberate way, with dark hair she wore pinned back and sharp eyes that processed a room the way a contractor prices a job. My son had introduced her 9 months ago, and from the beginning something about her had sat wrong with me. I'd told myself I was being a protective father, told myself I needed to give her a chance. "Dinner's almost ready," I said. "Daniel's been asking where you went." Her smile didn't waver. "I'll be right there." I nodded and walked back toward the kitchen. I didn't look back. But I made a decision in those 10 steps that I didn't fully understand yet. I only knew that everything had just changed, and I was the only one in this house who knew it. My son Daniel was 31 years old and had grown up on the same 340 acres outside Livingston that his grandfather had bought in 1961. Gentry Timber and Land was never a corporation or a dynasty. It was a family operation, built by my father, expanded by me, and now 2 years ago formally transferred into a partnership with Daniel, whose name sat beside mine on every deed and every contract. I'd done it for the same reason most fathers do things like that. I wanted him to have something real while I was still alive, to see him enjoy it. I wanted him to know the land was his. His mother had passed 6 years earlier from a brain aneurysm that took her in a single afternoon. No warning, no goodbye. After that, it was just the two of us, and we had found a rhythm together, a quiet and steady kind of closeness that I don't think either of us could have put into words. He worked the property alongside me. We ate dinner together most nights. We were not the kind of father and son who said "I love you" easily, but we understood each other in the way that people do when they've been through a loss that rearranges everything. When Daniel brought her home that first time and introduced her, she shook my hand firmly and said, "Daniel's told me so much about you. This property is absolutely stunning. Not your home, not the farm, the property." I filed that away and said nothing. She worked in real estate development in Houston, she told me. She was good at her job, she told me. She drove a car that cost more than I paid for my first tractor. I filed all of it away and said nothing. By the time he proposed to her in September, she had been to the property 4 times. She always wanted to walk the timber lines. She always asked questions about the lease agreements with the logging contractors. She complimented me constantly, with the focused sincerity of someone practicing a skill. My son was completely, helplessly in love with her. And I had told myself, over and over, that my unease was just grief, dressed up as instinct, that I missed my wife, that I was afraid of losing my son to someone else's orbit, that I was, as Daniel had gently suggested once, maybe just a little stuck in my ways. Thanksgiving night ended that conversation I'd been having with myself. I lay awake until 2 in the morning, staring at the ceiling fan, listening to the house settle. By the time light started coming through the curtains, I knew what I had to do, and I knew I had to do it carefully. My son hadn't believed me when I'd mentioned, months ago, that her questions about the property felt a little clinical. He'd laughed it off, said I'd feel differently once I got to know her better. If I walked into his room right now and told him what I'd heard, he would look at me the same way with that patient, slightly wounded expression that meant he thought I was projecting. He was in love. People in love are the last ones to see the thing clearly. I was going to need more than what I heard through a cracked door. I was going to need proof that no one could argue with. I called Pete Ramos at 7 the next morning. Pete had run a private investigations firm in Beaumont for 22 years before semi-retiring to a small office in Lufkin. We'd met a decade ago during a boundary dispute with a neighboring landowner. Someone had been quietly moving survey markers on the eastern fence line, and Pete was the one who documented it on camera over 3 weeks. He was methodical, patient, and utterly without drama. Exactly what I needed. "Pete," I said when he picked up, "it's Hal Gentry. I've got a situation." He was quiet for a moment. "How bad?" "My son is engaged to a woman who I believe is targeting the property." "What makes you think so?" I told him exactly what I'd heard. Every word, including the part about having done this before. Pete listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "That last part's important. If she's done it before, there's a trail somewhere. Give me 2 weeks." 2 weeks felt like 2 years. I went about my routines. I drove the fence lines, signed the quarterly contracts with the logging company, met with our accountant in Livingston on a Tuesday afternoon. Every evening I sat in my study and waited for Pete's calls, watching the deer come into the clearing at dusk, the way they always did, not really seeing them. Daniel called twice that week, cheerful, talking about the wedding timeline. He wanted a spring wedding. She wanted something intimate but elevated, whatever that meant. He asked me if I was feeling all right. I told him I was fine, just tired. 5 days in, Pete called. "Hal, her name isn't Brianna Collier. It's Brianna Vogt. Changed it legally about 4 years ago in Harris County. Before that, she went by Brianna Vogt Marsh, which was her married name. She was married to a man named Scott Marsh in Beaumont. They divorced in 2019. I leaned forward in my chair. What happened with the divorce? That's the interesting part. Scott Marsh owned a small trucking fleet with his father. 4 trucks, established routes, decent operation. Brianna entered the picture in 2017, married Scott in 2018, and had her name added to the LLC as a partner within 3 months of the wedding. The father didn't like it, said she pushed for it, and Scott went along. What happened to the business? It's gone. By the time the divorce was finalized, the LLC had been used as collateral on 2 loans that Brianna had arranged. Both loans went into default. The trucks were repossessed. Scott's father had a heart attack in the middle of the proceedings. He survived, but the business didn't. Scott works for a freight company now, making $20 an hour. I sat with that for a moment. My hands were very still on the desk. Is there more? There's always more. Give me another week. The second week was harder than the first. I saw Daniel on Wednesday when he stopped by to drop off some equipment invoices. He stayed for coffee and talked for an hour about a timber management plan he wanted to implement in the spring. Rotating harvests, replanting schedules, a 10-year strategy. He had a notebook full of diagrams. He'd been working on it for months. His face was lit up the way it gets when he's genuinely excited about something, the same way it looked when he was 12 and showed me a model he'd built of a steam engine. I listened to every word. I asked questions. I did not say anything about Brianna. After he left, I sat in the driveway for a long time, in the cold. Pete called on day 11. "You need to come to Lufkin. Bring an afternoon." We met at his office above a title company on Main Street. He had a folder on the desk and a laptop open. and he walked me through everything with the quiet efficiency of a man who has delivered bad news many times and has learned that directness is a kindness. Her ex-husband's family wasn't the only one. Before Scott Marsh, there had been a man in Port Arthur named Gerald Thibodeau, who owned 40 acres of coastal property that his family had held since the 1970s. She had dated his son, never married, but had gotten far enough into that family's circle to be added as a beneficiary on a small business account. When the relationship ended abruptly, about $40,000 was unaccounted for. Gerald reported it. The investigation went nowhere. Not enough documentation. She learns from each one, Pete said, turning the laptop to show me a recorded conversation. She's getting more sophisticated. He had gotten close enough to record her twice. Once at a coffee shop in the Woodlands, meeting with a man Pete had identified as a real estate attorney named Drew Fenn, not her attorney, not on any contract I'd ever seen. And once on a phone call captured through a directional microphone at 30 yards, standing outside a wine bar on a Tuesday evening. "Listen to this one," Pete said, pressing play. Her voice was relaxed, almost playful. "The structure is simple. Once we're married, and I'm on the timber partnership as a spouse, we petition to restructure the lease agreements through a new LLC. The old man signs off on it because Daniel tells him to. It looks like normal estate planning. By the time anyone realizes the original lease revenue is being redirected, we're already 2 steps ahead. The land itself stays on paper, but the income disappears." A man's voice. "And Daniel?" A pause. "Daniel is a sweet man. He's going to be very sad when our marriage doesn't work out, but by then, the restructuring will be done and the partnership dissolution will favor my shares. I've had Drew look at the original deed transfer. Hal made some mistakes when he moved the titles. There are gaps we can use." Pete stopped the recording. I realized I had been gripping the edge of the desk. "Who's the man she's talking to?" I asked. "Drew Fenn, the attorney. We believe he's a former colleague from her time working at a development firm in 2018. He's not licensed in Texas anymore, disbarred for mishandling client funds." I pushed back from the desk and walked to the window. Below me, Main Street was going about its ordinary business. A woman was walking a dog. 2 men were loading boxes into a hardware store. Everything completely normal. "The gaps," she mentioned, I said. "In the deed transfer. I had a land attorney look at the transfer documents. There are some, not catastrophic, but exploitable under the right circumstances." I turned back to face him. "What do I do with all of this?" Pete folded his hands on the desk. "You have a few options. You can take it to the DA's office. What you have is compelling, but there are no criminal charges, yet she hasn't committed the fraud. She's only planned it. The recordings are admissible in Texas for civil proceedings. But criminal use gets more complicated." Or, he paused. "You can set her up to commit the fraud on the record. Let her make the move, document it with witnesses, and hand the whole package to the DA at once. Cleaner. More prosecutable. More dangerous," I said. "Yes, because you'll need Daniel involved. And he doesn't know yet." That was the part I had been dreading. I drove home and sat in the kitchen for a long time. There was a photo on the refrigerator that Daniel had put there years ago. Before his mother died, the 2 of us on the back 40 on a fall morning. He was about 17, both of us grinning at something that was just off frame. His mother must have been the one holding the camera. I picked up the phone and called my attorney. Her name was Carol Pruitt, and she'd handled Gentry Timber's legal affairs for nearly 15 years. I gave her the short version and asked her to come to the property on Saturday morning. Then I called Pete back and told him I wanted to set the trap. I told Daniel on a Friday evening. I drove to his house in Livingston, a 2-bedroom place near the lake that he'd bought 3 years ago, and I sat down at his kitchen table and put Pete's folder in front of him without saying anything first. He looked at the folder, then at me, and his expression was already cautious. "What is this?" "Read it," I said. "Take as long as you need." He read in silence for 20 minutes. At some point he stopped reading and just sat very still. I watched his face move through expressions I recognized from when he was a boy: confusion, resistance, the particular stillness that comes just before something cracks. "This could be misinterpreted," he said finally. His voice was very careful, controlled. "Daniel, The recording, you don't know the context. Son, he looked up. I know this is the last thing you want to hear from me. I know that. I've been sitting on this for 2 weeks trying to figure out how to tell you, and there's no version of this that doesn't hurt. But I am your father, and I will not watch this happen to you and pretend I don't see it. He put the folder down on the table. He pressed his hands flat against the surface. He didn't say anything for a long time. She told me you'd do something like this, he said quietly. I kept my voice steady. What do you mean? A few weeks ago, she said she felt like you'd never accept her, that she thought you were looking for reasons to disapprove. He paused. She said I might have to choose eventually. I let that sit between us. She said that, I repeated. I thought she was being insecure. I told her she was wrong. He picked up one of the photographs Pete had included her and Drew Fenn at the coffee shop, leaning over documents, her finger pointing at something on a page. He studied it for a long time. When was this taken? 3 weeks ago. Tuesday morning. She told me she was in Dallas that week, a development conference. He set the photograph down very carefully, like it was made of something fragile. Neither of us spoke for a while. What do you want me to do? He said, finally. I need you to help me give her the opportunity to do exactly what she's planning. On the record, with witnesses. He looked at me. His eyes were red at the edges, but his jaw was set. He looked, in that moment, more like his mother than he ever had. Tell me how, he said. Carol drafted a set of documents over the following week. On paper, they represented a legitimate estate planning restructure, exactly the kind of move that someone in Brianna's position would find irresistible. The documents proposed a new LLC for the timber lease operations, with provisions for spousal inclusion upon marriage. They included language about partnership efficiency and simplified inheritance structures. To someone who'd been planning exactly this play, it would look like we'd handed them the keys. I had Daniel call her and tell her that his father had finally come around, that I wanted to modernize the property's structure before the wedding, that I needed both of them to come to Carol's office on a Thursday afternoon to go over paperwork. She said yes immediately. She said she was so glad I was warming up to the idea. The night before the meeting, Daniel stayed at the property. We didn't talk about the next day. We sat on the back porch after dinner, in the dark, listening to the tree frogs, the way we used to when he was in high school and couldn't sleep. I keep thinking about Mom, he said. Me too. She would have seen it right away, wouldn't she? It wasn't really a question. I thought about his mother, about her particular brand of clear-eyed patience, the way she could read a person in a single conversation and know exactly who they were. Probably before she finished shaking her hand, I said. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. We stayed out there until the moon came up. She walked into Carol's office Thursday afternoon in a charcoal blazer and low heels, carrying a leather portfolio, looking every bit like someone who does this professionally. Which, in a sense, she did. She kissed Daniel on the cheek, shook Carol's hand warmly, and sat down at the conference table with the easy confidence of someone who thinks they are the smartest person in the room. Drew Fenn was not with her. That was interesting. She was running this one herself. Carol walked her through the documents slowly. I watched her eyes move across each page. I watched the moment she understood what she was looking at, a tiny shift, a slight quickening, like a hawk spotting movement in the grass. She asked 3 questions, all of them precise, all of them aimed at the provisions that would benefit her most. She suggested 2 minor modifications to the partnership language that would, as Pete had predicted, give a spouse disproportionate claims in a dissolution. Carol wrote down the modifications and nodded as if she was considering them. I think we can work with that, Carol said. Let me redraft and we can circle back next week. That was when Brianna made her mistake. She reached into her portfolio and produced her own documents, neatly typed, already formatted to match the structure we'd shown her, with her suggested modifications already incorporated. She slid them across the table toward Carol. I had my own attorney look at a similar structure, she said. This version might save us a step. The room went very quiet. Carol looked at the documents without touching them. She looked at me. Then she looked at Brianna. Your attorney, Carol said. Would that be Drew Fenn? The color in her face shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. I'm not sure what you mean, she said. Drew Fenn was disbarred in Texas in 2021 for mishandling client funds, Carol said. His name is on the footer of this document, page 3. Brianna looked down at the document in front of her. For the first time since I'd known her, the smooth surface of her expression showed a crack. Daniel spoke then. He'd been quiet the entire meeting, sitting to my left with his hands folded on the table. His voice was completely level. "We know about Scott Marsh," he said. "We know about the trucking company. We know about Gerald Thibodeau in Port Arthur. We have recordings, Brianna. We have photographs. We have 2 weeks of documentation." He paused. "And we have this." He placed his hand flat on top of the documents she'd brought. "Which you just handed to our attorney of your own free will?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at me. I don't know what she expected to see. Triumph, maybe, or anger. I didn't feel either of those things, sitting there. I felt something quieter. The specific relief of a man who has been carrying something very heavy and has finally been allowed to set it down. "I think you should leave," I said. "And I think you should speak to an attorney, a legitimate one." She left without another word. She took her portfolio. She left the documents. Carol was on the phone with the district attorney's office before Brianna's car had cleared the parking lot. The investigation took 4 months. Pete turned over his full documentation, including the recordings. The DA's office contacted Scott Marsh's family in Beaumont and the Thibodeau family in Port Arthur. Both cooperated. Scott's father, who had largely recovered from his heart attack, agreed to speak to investigators. Gerald Thibodeau wrote a 12-page statement. Drew Fenn was arrested in February on charges of conspiracy to commit fraud and practicing law without a license. He took a plea deal in March and testified against her in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her trial lasted 9 days in a Polk County courtroom. I sat in the gallery every day. On the 5th day, Scott Marsh took the stand. He was quiet, precise, and devastating. He described in plain language how the business had been built by his grandfather, how his father had run it for 30 years, and how it had been gone within 18 months of his ex-wife's name appearing on the paperwork. He described his father sitting at the kitchen table the night the last truck was repossessed, staring at the wall, not speaking. On the 7th day, Daniel testified. I watched my son sit in that witness box and describe, in front of a full courtroom, how he had been manipulated, how he had argued with his father on her behalf, how he had believed, completely, that the woman he loved was exactly who she said she was. He spoke without self-pity, which made it harder to listen to, not easier. At one point, he looked directly at the jury and said, "I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you this so you understand what she does and how she does it, and so it doesn't happen to the next person." I had to look at the floor for a moment after he said that. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty on all counts. Conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted theft by deception, and fraudulent use of legal instruments. She was sentenced to 9 years. As the court officers led her past the gallery, she glanced toward the defense table, toward her attorney, toward the door everywhere except at me or Daniel. But at the last moment, just before she reached the door, she looked back. Our eyes met. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the last 9 days hadn't already said more clearly. I thought about what Pete had told me, months ago, sitting in his office in Lufkin. She's getting more sophisticated. It occurred to me, watching her walk out of that courtroom, that this was the first time she had been stopped. Every other time, she had walked away. The Port Arthur situation, no charges. The Beaumont marriage dissolved cleanly, money already moved. She had operated for years with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences, who had come to believe that being careful was the same as being untouchable. She had miscalculated one thing, the difference between a man who is being careful and a man who is paying attention. The spring came early that year. By April, the back 40 was green in a way that almost hurts to look at. That particular intense green that East Texas does in spring when the light comes through the pines at the right angle and turns everything luminous. Daniel had already started on his timber management plan. He'd brought in a forestry consultant, staked out the first rotation zone, planted a test row of loblolly seedlings along the eastern fence line. I walked out to find him one afternoon, and he was kneeling in the dirt next to a seedling, pressing the soil around its base with both hands, the way you do when you're making sure something is going to hold. He looked up when he heard me coming. "These'll be ready for first harvest in about 15 years, he said. "I know. You'll be almost 80. I know that too." He stood up and wiped his hands on his jeans, looking out across the property. The light was doing that thing it does in late afternoon in April, going gold and heavy, laying itself across the land like something you could almost touch. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You don't." "I do. I told you that you were being overprotective. I told you to give her a chance. I told you—" He stopped. "I let her use me to doubt you. She was very good at what she did," I said. "That doesn't excuse it." I thought about what to say. I thought about his mother, about how she would handle this particular moment, what she would find that was true and useful and kind all at once. She had always been better at that than me. "You were in love," I said finally. "That's not a character flaw. That's just being human. And when it mattered, when I needed you to trust me, you did." He looked at me. "That's the part I'll remember," I said. "Not the rest of it. That's the part that counts." He didn't say anything. He looked back out at the seedling row, at the fence line, at the timber beyond it going green and gold in the late light. After a while, he put his hand on my shoulder, briefly, the way men in my family have always done, instead of saying certain things out loud. We stood there for a while, not talking, watching the light change. The logging contractor called that evening to talk about the summer schedule. I signed a 3-year extension on the lease agreement the following week. Daniel filed the timber management plan with the county. We had dinner together on Thursday nights, the same way we'd been doing for years, and sometimes I'd catch him looking at the property, at the land itself, the fences, the pine ridge line, with the expression of a man who understands, maybe for the first time, exactly what he has. There's something I've thought about a lot since everything ended. People ask what the hardest part was. They expect me to say it was the evidence, or the waiting, or sitting through the trial. But the hardest part was that Thursday night in his kitchen, putting a folder on the table and watching my son's face as he read it. The hardest part was knowing that telling him the truth was going to cause him pain that I couldn't take back, and doing it anyway because the alternative was worse. That's the thing nobody tells you about protecting someone you love. It doesn't always look like protection. Sometimes it looks like the most hurtful thing you've ever done to them. Sometimes the truest form of love is the one the other person resents you for, right up until the moment they don't. My son shook her hand at a charity event 8 months later she was attending through a nonprofit she'd been connected to, and he was perfectly civil, perfectly composed. He told me about it that Sunday over the phone, matter-of-factly, like it was just a thing that had happened. He said it felt like meeting someone from a story he'd read once, a long time ago. Someone who'd had a lot of power over him in the telling, but had no power over him at all now that the book was closed. I thought that was about as well put as anything I'd heard. The 340 acres are still ours. The timber partnership still has both our names on it. The seedlings along the eastern fence line are about 8 inches tall now, which the forestry consultant says is right on schedule. Last month, Daniel told me he'd met someone, a woman who teaches high school biology in Livingston, who grew up in Nacogdoches, who he met at a county land trust meeting where she was advocating for riparian buffer preservation. He said she'd argued with him for 45 minutes about tree spacing requirements, and he'd found it, and I'm quoting directly here, extremely attractive. I told him I'd like to meet her when he was ready. He said he thought I'd like her. He said she asked a lot of good questions. I told him that was a fine thing to say about a person. I'm 63 years old, and I've spent most of those years working land that my father worked before me, learning that the things worth having are the things worth protecting. The things that last are not always the things that look permanent. A contract can be dissolved. A deed can be contested. A business can be taken apart piece by piece by someone who knows which screws to loosen first. But there are things that can't be restructured, can't be collateralized, can't be moved into a new LLC and drained quietly while everyone's looking the other way. What I have with my son is one of those things. I know that now, In a way, I didn't before all of this started. Not because it was tested, I already knew it could survive hard times, but because I watched it hold when it was under the specific pressure of doubt and betrayal, and a very calculated effort to come between us. It held. That's not nothing. That's everything. If you're a parent watching this, trust what you know about your child. Trust the thing in you that knows the difference between fear and instinct. And if you ever find yourself in a hallway at Thanksgiving, hearing something through a cracked door that turns your whole world sideways, take a breath, stay calm, and then get to work.